The snow had come early that year, gentle at first, then all at once. Bitter Wind Hollow lay wrapped in a hush of white, the kind that deadened sound and slowed footsteps. The main street was little more than a slush-rutted path, flanked by crooked buildings, half trading post, half memory of better days. Above it all, the clouds hung low and unmoving, as if the ski itself had forgotten how to breathe. At the edge of the square behind the old mercantile, a makeshift stockyard stood like an open wound against the snow. The last of the crowd had drifted away, leaving footprints that vanished beneath the falling flakes. A lone cage remained, iron bars, frost-rusted and cold to the touch. Inside it, the last lot sat still as bone. She was not young by the standards of the buyers, nor old enough to be discarded. Her skin was the tone of earth after storm, her features sharp, defined neither soft nor asking to be understood. The name they called her when they bothered to was Weena, though she hadn't spoken it aloud in weeks. The men said she bit, that she stared too hard, that she never begged. Too much fight, not enough obedience. Jonas Burke, the man who ran the block with the same smugness he wore on his hat, had tried every trick he knew to make her kneel and failed. "She ain't worth the hide she's wearing," he'd muttered to a buyer from Cheyenne who'd offered half coin and a whiskey jug. "Let her rot." Then came the reply. And so she sat knee to chest, arms bound, blood dried at the edge of her mouth, from where someone's ring had found skin. The cold gnawed at her bare feet, but she did not shiver. Weena Tala was long past shivering. Not far off, a man leaned against the post by the smithy shed, watching with the kind of stillness that made animals wary. He was tall. In that tired way some men are, as though their height had outgrown their need for posture. His hat brim was low, dusted with snow, and the long canvas coat he wore bore signs of wear at the cuffs and elbows. A rifle lay across his saddle, still sheathed. Harlan Beckett hadn't come for trouble. He hadn't come for people. He came for lead, salt, and something to patch the barn roof. Supplies no more. He'd meant to ride in payout and be gone before noon. The town had other plans. When his eyes found the cage, he hadn't meant to stop. But he had. And then stayed. She looked at him once, direct, unflinching, and didn't look again. That more than any pleading lodged in his ribs. He didn't believe in signs. Not anymore. But that stare, that stillness, it held something. Something sharp. Something he hadn't felt since the dirt above his daughter's grave had frozen solid and refused to soften. Jonas caught him watching. "Ain't worth your trouble, Beckett," he said, approaching with his usual air of condescension, wrapped in false cheer. "She's near feral. Bit Slade's finger clean to the bone last week. Can't keep her tied nor beat her tame." Harlan didn't answer. "She'll set your place afire, or slit your throat in sleep. Ask anyone here. Still nothing. Suit yourself." Jonas spat to the side and leaned on the cage. $2 and a cartridge belt. I'll even throw in a chain." Harlan reached into his coat, pulled out $2 silver, worn but clean. No belt, no chain. Jonas raised an eyebrow, but took the money. Harlan stepped forward. No drama, no fanfare. Just motion, just decision. The key clinked against metal, loud in the hush. The lock gave way with a reluctant groan. The door opened, but Weena did not move. Harlan didn't offer a word. He didn't offer pity either. Just a hand. Not open in gentleness. Not closed in command. Just there. She looked at it, then at him. No plea, no thanks. Slowly, stiff from cold and wounds, she stood. The movement was small, but it felt like defiance. She stepped out on her own. The snow fell thicker now, hiding the sky. Harlan turned without speaking, walked to his horse. She followed at a distance, not looking back. Jonas watched them go, his mouth curled like a dog denied its bone. They left Bitter Wind Hollow in silence. The wagon creaked with the rhythm of worn wheels. Weena sat in the back, wrapped in a wool blanket. He tossed her without a word. Her eyes never left the horizon behind them. Harlan didn't speak. He hadn't spoken more than 6 words to anyone in a week. The last time he let someone into his home, they were buried a month later. The wind cut through the grasslands, hissing through dead stalks, rising like whispers between graves. The prairie stretched out endless, blank as the future. Neither of them knew what they were riding toward, but both of them, in their own right, battered way, knew exactly what they were leaving behind. And sometimes that was enough. For now. The prairie around Harlan Beckett's ranch was no friend to strangers. It rolled outward in every direction, a sea of golden brown and ghost white, under snow, tall grasses cracking beneath the weight of winter. No fences marked the edge of his land, just wind ski and a silence so thick it pressed against the ribs. His cabin stood alone on a slight rice back, braced against a line of leafless cottonwoods. It was not much to look at: one room, a lean-to for supplies, a barn that leaned like an old man after too many winters. But it was solid, built by his own hands long after the war and the dying. Weena Tala didn't speak when he brought her there. She stepped from the wagon on her own, the wool blanket still wrapped around her shoulders. Her eyes flicked over the roof, the windows, the tree line, measuring, calculating. Then she walked toward the cabin without a word, slow and cautious, like approaching something that might bite. He didn't tell her what to do, didn't show her where to sleep, just unhitched the horse and hauled the grain inside. When he came back out, she was gone. He didn't panic, didn't shout. He just stood still, breath steaming in the cold air, and waited. An hour passed, then another. It was nearly dark when he heard the crunch of snow behind the woodshed. Her silhouette appeared, shoulders hunched, legs scraped, hair tangled with frost. She didn't look at him, just stepped into the cabin, hands shaking from cold, and moved toward the fire. He had left it burning low, a plate of beans and bread set near the hearth. She sat on the floor without asking, back to the wall, and ate every bite. He didn't ask where she'd gone. She didn't offer. That was how it began. The days that followed passed like wind through dry grass, quiet, repetitive, edged with something unspoken. Harlan rose at dawn, same as always. He worked without hurry, without pause. Fed the horses, broke ice in the trough, split wood with even swings. He didn't speak unless necessary. The dog Flint followed him everywhere, silent and stiff in his joints. Weena kept to the cabin, slept by the fire, watched him with eyes that never blinked too long. He didn't lock the door, didn't hide the rifle. If she meant to run, she would. He had no interest in keeping anyone who didn't want to be there. Still, every night when he returned from the barn, she was there. Not waiting exactly, just present. She swept the floor once, mended a tear in the curtain, washed her hands in the basin he set out each morning. Not a word passed between them for days. But the silence grew a shape, not sharp, not hostile. Something else, something closer to truce. On the 4th night, the quiet broke. She had gone again just after dusk. He noticed when the fire dropped low, and the blanket sat folded untouched. He didn't chase her, but he saddled his horse. She hadn't taken food or the coat, which meant she wasn't planning far, just running. He found her near the old trap line west of the ridge, limping through the drifts, half buried in snow. But he wasn't the first to find her. Billy Slade had been out hunting rabbits, or so he claimed later. More likely looking for trouble. He always had the smell of cheap tobacco and rotten teeth, something Harlan could spot a mile off. Slade had Weena by the arm, dragging her toward his mule, hand raised. "She's a damn runner," he spat. You ought to put iron on her, Beckett, like the rest of 'em. Weena didn't struggle, but her eyes were bright with fury, jaw clenched tight enough to crack. Harlan said nothing at first, then he dismounted, walked slow through the snow until he stood 3 feet from Slade. Let go, Slade sneered. Ain't yours to say. Harlan didn't raise his voice. It is now. Slade hesitated. There was a line in Harlan's face, something dark and final. Not rage, not even threat, just certainty. He let go. Weena stumbled, caught herself. Didn't run. Just stared at both men like choosing which was less likely to strike. Slade spit in the snow. She comes back to town. She's mine. Harlan didn't reply. He turned his back on Slade, slow and deliberate, and held out a hand to Weena. She didn't take it, but she followed. Back at the cabin, he didn't speak. He stoked the fire, laid another blanket near the hearth. She sat without looking at him. Later, when the wind howled and the wood crackled in the stove, he heard her shift. Why didn't you hit him, she asked, voice rough from disuse. He looked at the fire. Didn't need to. Silence again. Then, he would've. He nodded. I know. She didn't thank him. He didn't expect her to. But when he laid down on his cot, her breathing had changed. Slower. Deeper. Not trust. Not yet. But less fear. It was a start. Out there the prairie still froze under moonlight. Nothing moved but wind and the occasional coyote cry in the dark. But inside that little cabin, for the first time in years, the silence went empty. It was waiting. Snow drifted higher around the cabin walls. The prairie wind came softer now, less biting, but constant a breath. The land never quite exhaled. Inside, the rhythm of 2 people living together without speaking had settled into something like peace. Not comfort, not yet, but coexistence. Weena Tala had begun to move through the space, not like a guest or a prisoner, but like someone who had accepted the fact of being there, at least for now. She swept the floors each morning before the fire burned steady. She cleaned the basin with ash and cloth-chopped roots for stew when she found them near the woodshed. She didn't ask permission. Harlan didn't give orders. The work was its own language. Their days were a series of silent exchanges. He passed her a coat when she reached for the door. She stacked kindling by the hearth without being told. He brought back rabbit from the traps. She seasoned it with herbs he didn't know grew out here. Still, there were no stories between them. No past shared. No names of towns of family of loss. But Silence held all those things. It was safer that way. Until the day she opened the wrong door. It had snowed again the night before, a soft fall that blanketed everything in quiet. Harlan had gone early to check the fence line, leaving the stove warm and the firewood stacked by the door. Weena stayed behind. She'd planned to sew the tear in her borrowed dress and boil water for the horse trough. But curiosity has a shape, and sometimes it waits behind a closed door. The room was tucked behind the main wall, almost hidden unless one knew it was there. The door was old pine handle, rusted, slightly warped from moisture. It wasn't locked. She didn't intend to enter. She only meant to look. But the hinges gave way, with a sound like breath held too long. Inside, the air felt different, older, unwaged. Dust floated like memories in the sunlight that slanted through a narrow window. The walls were bare wood, but one table stood near the far corner, covered with things arranged in a kind of reverence. A child's dress, folded carefully. Faded blue calico. A stuffed toy rabbit, one ear missing. A photograph, black and white, edges curled. A girl no older than 6, grinning wide, her hand clutching a man's trousers just out of frame. Weena stared at it a long time. Then her eyes fell to something else. A bracelet. Simple braided horsehair with turquoise beads. the kind worn by Cheyenne children for protection, the kind her mother used to make. Her throat went dry. She stepped closer, heart pounding in her ears. The knot patterned tight left over right, repeated 5 times, was her mother's. She remembered because her little sister used to cry when it was tied too tight. She remembered the beads one was chipped. Her sister had fallen against the river rocks. She remembered the way her mother had slapped her for not watching the girl better. She remembered because this bracelet had been tied around her sister's wrist the day the soldiers came. Her hands trembled. This wasn't just some shrine to a lost child. This was a grave of memory. And somehow Harlan Beckett had been there. She didn't hear him return, didn't notice the snow melt from his boots as he stepped inside. His voice when it came was low. "You weren't meant to see that." She turned breath, caught eyes flashing with something between grief and rage. "This was hers?" she asked, pointing to the photo. He nodded. "My daughter, Sarah." Her voice was hoarse. "Where did she get that bracelet?" He didn't answer at first. Then quieter. "A raid near the Winded Elk River. Winter of '79. They said the village was harboring escaped prisoners. We were told to burn everything." Weena took a step back. "That wasn't a prison camp. That was our home." His jaw clenched. "I didn't know. I didn't ask. I was 12, she whispered. "I hid under a storage pit. My sister, she was 5. She couldn't stop crying." He looked away. "I remember a child screaming." Silence swelled between them. Not the silence of cohabitation, but the kind that comes before storms, when all birds fall quiet and the air turns still with fear. She crossed her arms, holding herself against a shaking that had nothing to do with cold. "So what now?" she asked. "Do I stay here under the same roof as the man who took her from me?" He didn't flinch. "You can go. I won't stop you. Will you apologize?" He took a breath, and it came rough. "If I could trade every mile I've ridden since for that day back, I would. But I didn't light the fire. I didn't shoot. I stood there. I let it happen. That's the same as doing it." She stared at him. "Yes," she said. "It is." He didn't try to defend himself. Just stood still, letting her look at him, letting the weight of everything they hadn't said settle in the room. "I didn't know it was yours," he added. "The bracelet. I kept it because it was the only thing left that felt real." Weena looked down at her hands. They were calloused, scarred, strong. The kind that survived. "My sister's name was Asha," she said finally. Then she turned and left the room. That night they didn't speak. He set the table. She didn't sit. He left food near the fire. She didn't touch it. When the wind howled through the gaps in the shutters, she pulled her blanket tighter and stared at the flames as if they owed her answers. But she didn't leave. She could have. But she didn't. And that somehow was heavier than any forgiveness. It was the echo of the dead living in 2 people who had once stood on opposite sides of the fire and were now sitting in its same light. The days after the door opened passed like slow smoke through broken rafters. Nothing exploded. Nothing shattered. But everything had changed. They moved through the cabin like 2 ghosts, haunted by the same memory, only now they knew the name of the other's pain. The bracelet sat untouched on the table where Weena had left it. The door to that room remained ajar, not wide, but enough to remind them both that silence no longer shielded them. Harlan worked longer hours outside. Weena took to rising earlier, avoiding him in the mornings. They shared meals in a kind of ritual, bread, beans, a passing of the kettle, but didn't meet each other's eyes. He watched her sometimes, though she pretended not to notice. There was something in the way she moved now, less guarded, more deliberate. She knew he had been there in the worst of her past. And yet she stayed. That truth alone hollowed something in him. because he couldn't decide if it was mercy way or vengeance. He found himself checking the edge of the woodpile more often, looking to see if her footprints were still fresh in the snow come morning. They always were. On a gray afternoon that carried the scent of thaw, the sound of hooves broke the quiet. Harlan looked up from splitting wood to see Mabel O'Connor riding up the slope. He hadn't seen her since fall, when she'd brought blackberry jam and conversation he didn't want. Mabel dismounted stiffly, her coat heavy with fur, her gloved hands neat on the reins. "I brought eggs," she said without smile, holding up a small basket. He nodded, wiping his hands on a rag. "Appreciate it." She followed him to the porch, eyes scanning the cabin. "Haven't seen you in town." "Had no need. You'll need salt soon enough, I reckon." She lingered a moment. Then, without being invited, stepped through the open door. Inside, Weena stood by the hearth, stirring the pot with her back turned. She turned slightly at the sound face, unreadable. Mabel's mouth tensed. She didn't speak right away, just looked. Took in the worn dress, the braid down Weena's back, the bare feet. "Didn't know you had company." "She helps around the place," Harlan said. "She doesn't look like a housemaid." "She's not." Silence, hard as gravel. Weena turned back to the pot as if the exchange meant nothing. But Harlan saw the way her fingers clenched on the wooden spoon. "I'll be going," Mabel said finally, voice tight. "Word travels fast out here, Harlan. People talk." "Let 'em," he said quietly. But her look said plenty before she rode away. 2 days later, he went into town for flour and nails. The clerk at the general store, a man who once shared whiskey with Harlan behind the barn, didn't meet his eyes. When Harlan placed his goods on the counter, the man hesitated, then said, "Might want to take your business elsewhere." "Didn't know you were full up on coin," Harlan said evenly. "No offense, Beckett, but there's folks who don't like what they're hearing." "What exactly are they hearing?" The clerk looked away. "That you've got a savage up in your bed. That you turned your place into some heathen lodge." Harlan didn't flinch. Just picked up his things, set the money down, and left without another word. But the walk back to his horse felt colder than usual. He didn't tell Weena. Didn't need to. That night he chopped more firewood than they'd use in a week. When he came in, snow on his shoulders, she was sewing by the fire. The bracelet had been moved, placed in a small wooden box, and tucked under the hearth. He said nothing about it. She said nothing about the wood in his hair. But something was changing again. She looked up as he passed, her eyes soft in the firelight, and for the first time since the truth between them cracked open, she didn't look away. She said, "I know you didn't pull the match." He stopped. "But I also know you didn't stop it." He nodded slowly. "I was 12, she said, "but I remember everything, and I still chose to stay." That quiet held more weight than any confession. Harlan sat down across from her, close enough to feel the warmth of the fire between them. They didn't touch, didn't move. But when the log snapped and the coals shifted, she leaned forward slightly, setting her thread aside. "I don't need an apology," she said. "I need to know you won't pretend I'm someone else. I never have." She breathed deep, chest rising slow under the wool. Then, in a gesture that was almost nothing, and somehow everything, she reached across the space between them and placed her hand on his. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't soft. But it was chosen. He turned, his hand fingers curling around hers. They sat like that for a long while, firelight flickering against the walls, no longer afraid of silence or memory. Outside, the wind rose again, but the fire inside didn't burn with rage or sorrow. It just warmed. Later that night, the fire had burned low, casting long amber shadows across the cabin walls. Outside, the wind stirred in the cottonwoods, whispering through the eaves like some old memory, not ready to let go. Weena sat close to the hearth, her legs tucked beneath her hair loose around her shoulders. She wasn't watching the flames anymore, just staring into the coals like they might tell her something about tomorrow. Harlan moved quietly around the room, setting the kettle on the edge of the stove boots, soft on the worn floorboards. He passed her once, pausing to lay a folded wool blanket beside her. As he turned away, his hand brushed a strand of her hair that had fallen across her brow. He didn't speak, just eased it back behind her ear with a kind of gentleness that surprised even him. She looked up at him, then not startled, not confused, just meeting his eyes with something warm and unspoken. Her breath caught, but only slightly. He cleared his throat and moved to the chair by the fire, but didn't sit. Instead, he stood there a long moment, looking at her in the soft light. Then, as she shifted slightly to reach for the blanket, his gaze dropped not to her face, but to the curve of her belly, soft beneath the fabric. Not yet swollen with life, not yet changed by the months ahead. But something in him stirred anyway. And without thinking, without meaning to intrude, he reached out. His hand rested lightly on her side, just above the waist, steady and quiet. A touch meant not to claim, but to promise. Wina didn't flinch. She didn't move at all. She only closed her eyes, let out a slow breath, and leaned just slightly, barely a tilt toward the weight of his hand. It was no declaration, no vow. But something passed between them in that stillness, older than words, stronger than fear. He let his hand drop a moment later, stepped back, and finally sat. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Because in the hush of that late hour, surrounded by old grief and new warmth, both of them understood they weren't alone anymore. And maybe, just maybe, they never would be again. Winter light seeped through the cabin window, in pale, wavering streams like the fragile bond stretching between two souls who'd once been adversaries. Wina Tala, sitting cross-legged on the floor, held a chipped tin cup of coffee between her hands. She sipped slowly, warming her palms. Across from her, Harlan Beckett sat in his usual armchair, gaze drifting toward the bundle of papers, unfinished lesson sheets he'd left lying there. Today's lesson, Harlan Wina Home Trust. She whispered the words, and each utterance felt like a stone dropping into the still water of his soul. Harlan. He cleared his throat. Good. She looked up, eyes bright in the cold light. My name, Wina Tala. Your name. He nodded, warmth flickering inside him. More than she'd ever shown a first thread of emotional repair. It was progress. But it was a moment he both craved and feared to be named, and to name another. Naming meant claiming, and claiming meant stakes. The piece they'd stitched together was already unraveling. Word reached Bitter Wind Hollow, first river southward, carried by whispers in the saloon and gossip at the feed store. A woman of native blood living with Beckett. Weeks after her arrival, good flour had stopped for sale at the general store. A bullet hole torn through Harlan's barn door. Now a shot rattled past the cabin window. No one hit, but the message clear. They knew. He found Wina in the barn at dawn, crouched beside Flint. The old dog whined softly. Harlan knelt beside her, gently closed her fingers around his. They're testing us, he said quietly. She nodded, eyes steady. Life had taught her calm in greater storms. She didn't run this time. She had a reason to stay. The first flame of belonging had taken root. But it was Jonas Burke who pushed them toward open truth and reckoning. Beckett recognized him before recognition settled in Wina. Jonas rode into the acreage with Billy Slade close behind horse's flanks, rubbed raw by the saddle. They stopped at the edge of the wood line. Jonas dismounted, his boots crunching the dead grass. His smile when he spoke was giddy and cruel. Morning, Beckett. Looks like you've got quite the house guest. Harlan stood, words taut in his chest. This is my home. Jonas grinned. It'll be hers soon enough after I'm through with you. He spat. Hope you taught her some English. Then Billy stepped forward, ears back, jaw clenched, ready to move on the word. Weena rose, shoulders square. It wasn't only fear in her eyes, it was history. She spoke her first fully formed English sentence. "You leave now." The voice wasn't loud, but it carried ice. Jaime had said it. Weena had said it. Jonas laughed, a bitter, low chuckle. "Funny that you talk now. Funny I remember that raid." He turned to Harlan. "Funny how Beckett here followed me into that canyon 5 years ago when we burned that village by the Winded Elk River. Funny how that bracelet showed back up." Weena's stomach dropped. She held on to Harlan's sleeve as though he would vanish. Harlan's voice came slow, crushed. "You were in command." Jonas smirked. "Damn straight." He looked at Weena. "That was your village, wasn't it? I don't suppose you told her that." Weena squeezed Harlan's sleeve, knuckles white. "Don't speak for me," she said. "I remember who started the fire." The wind rose, ripping dead stalks from the prairie. Horses stamped in their stalls. Weena's heart thundered with the memory of that winter, his winter. She'd closed her eyes back then, but every sound still echoed. She lifted her head. "You ordered it." Jonas's eyes flicked with surprise, then madness. "She has your tongue." Beckett. Harlan stepped forward, voice low. "She found it." He looked at Weena, then Jonas. "Think of me what you will, but she's home." Weena saw it then, the quiet certainty behind his eyes. He wouldn't lose her again. Not to fire, not to fear. That afternoon, Harlan harnessed the wagon. Weena climbed in, carrying 2 blankets and the small wooden box that held the bracelet and letters from Reverend Josiah Clay. He rode along. Neither spoke. The journey to the minister's small weathered church, half built, half forgotten, was traveled over frozen swales and wind-bent grasses. Each footfall echoed decisions heavier than any ammunition they might carry. Reverend Clay waited outside, hunched beneath the cross carved from driftwood. His shoulders were stooped, but his eyes held fire. He greeted Weena with a nod. Harlan had never seen him offer before. Inside the church, lit by only a few sconces, Clay listened as Harlan spoke, voice thick. "I can't make her forgive me. I can't even forgive myself. I need help." Weena placed the box on the altar, opened it to reveal an old worn ribbon that braided horsehair, turned gray with age. Reverend Clay glanced at Harlan, then Weena slowly. He spoke in measured tones. "There is no healing without confession, no home without accountability. Not apology, mind you, but acknowledgement." He paused. "And a choice. Will you make it?" Weena knelt, her breath rising. She looked to Harlan. He nodded, soft, quiet. The first time since she arrived, he'd given consent. She looked back to Clay. "I choose to stay." Clay closed his eyes, nodded. "Then you are both walking toward something secret. Not forgiveness, but growth. Not forgetting, but finding." They left with the sun slipping behind low hills. Weena carried the box, its contents heavier and lighter than before. Harlan held the reins, but his hands shook. They didn't look at each other while riding home yet. Each step was a promise to face the world together. No fences around their land could hold as tight as the tie they had forged in those stolen words, that naming, that confession. Outside, bitter Wind Hollow brooded in shadows, but inside them, they carried new light. And for now, that light was enough. That same afternoon, as Elias and Weena guided the wagon down the muddy road toward Reverend Josiah's place, Mabel stood behind the lace-curtained window of her boarding house. The street was quiet, save for the crows hopping along the eaves and the echo of wagon wheels fading into the cottonwoods. She'd seen them pass. The girl wore a shawl pulled tight, eyes scanning the porches. Elias, as always, kept to silence. But it was Weena's gaze that caught Mabel off guard. Eyes that once flinched now met hers with something quiet, unreadable. Not defiance, not fear. Something else. Maybe dignity. Behind her, footsteps thudded heavy. Jonas Burke, brushing snow off his coat, eyes sharp like steel filings. He said nothing to her, just poured a drink and stared out toward the same trail. "You'll push this too far," Mabel said without turning. Her voice low, but it lingered in the room. Jonas chuckled dryly. "That man's already dead inside. I'm just helping the dirt settle." Mabel didn't answer. Her fingers twisted in the hem of her apron. Outside, a boy ran past with a sack of flour, not looking at the house. No one had lately. She turned then slow and caught Jonas's reflection in the glass. Something brittle behind his eyes, like a crack in a window that hadn't yet shattered. "You don't look at her the way you used to," she murmured. Jonas narrowed his eyes. "You still think there's a side to pick here, Mabel?" She looked down then away. "I don't know anymore." Later, as Jonas strapped on his revolver and stalked out into the dusk, Mabel stood at the doorway long after he vanished from sight. Her hands trembled just once. She didn't light the lantern. She just sat in the quiet, watching the snow begin again. Spring didn't announce itself in the prairie. It arrived quietly, melting the last drifts, softening the land with muddy promise. At the foot of the bluff behind their cabin, a single green shoot unfurled from the earth, where two graves lay warming to the sun that slipped higher in pale blue skies. Harlan stood beside Weena at that edge of the land one evening, the wind soft after the months of winter's bite. He watched her planting a small sapling, her hands steady in the warmed soil. She had told him to close his eyes. He trusted her. He felt the sapling in his palm, fragile but real. No ring was spoken, no words pronounced. The tree itself was the vow. They would grow together, take root in shared dirt. He opened his eyes. Her smile was all the answer he needed. Not long after town rumblings intensified, Weena was 4 months along when the first stone broke a pane in their kitchen window. Flint's bark sounded more like a cry than a warning. Harlan cleaned up the glass in the morning, while Weena slept, fingers resting on her belly as she stirred. Neighbors averted their eyes when he bought supplies. He felt eyes judging the child they couldn't see. He felt a pull in Weena's gaze, a silent question. "Is this worth it?" Every time she caught his eye, he nodded, but his heart ached like memory of old bullets. Then late one dusky afternoon, danger came back. Harlan had just returned from the pasture with the last of the herd. Weena carried a basket of herbs from the barn. The wind smelled faintly of rain. Jonas Burke and Billy Slade appeared near the fence, not riding, but walking, guns in hands. Their boots fussed through the thawing grasses. No horse meant intent. The world slowed. Weena dropped her basket. Harlan's hand moved to the rifle at his side. His fingers clenched the wood hard, his breath shallow. For the first time in years, he felt the old weight return, a hollow thrum in his chest, like boots on frozen ground. War wasn't just memory. It was alive under his skin. The shape of death took form again, not in trenches or ambushes, but right here in the caving light of home. His palm itched where the scar was thickest. And yet this time it wasn't for country command or vengeance. It was for her. It was for the quiet they'd built together, board by board, night by night. Jonas raised an arm. "I gave you time, Beckett. I gave her time." "She's nobody's now," he spat. "Don't come near her," Harlan said. Billy took a menacing step forward. "This land's ours now." Jonas laughed, a hollow echo. "I want blood." Weena stood between them, pale in the evening glow. She whispered in Dakota words Harlan didn't understand, soft, sharp warning. Jonas stopped. Weena looked at Harlan go inside. He moved her back gently, understanding that this moment, like the sapling, was rooted in care. Billy swung his gun. Harlan stepped forward, fired a warning shot. Dirt exploded at Billy's feet, anger meeting resolve. Jonas cursed. He raised his own weapon. Before a single shot went off, a figure stepped between them, Mabel coat, flapping eyes hard. She stood in front of Harlan, blocking Jonas. "Stop this," she said, voice steady but grieved. "It ends here," Jonas sneered. "You think you stand here with me?" Mabel didn't back down. "I've been wrong." Billy shifted, uncertain. Jonas pulled the trigger. There was a flash. Then Jonas fell, Mabel's gun trembling in her hand. Harlan caught Weena as she gasped, legs buckling. Billy turned, panic in his eyes, but Flint leapt beside Harlan and knocked him aside. Weena clutched her belly, hitting the ground beside Harlan. Jonas lay quiet as thunder rolling out of sight. The aftermath was surreal. Harlan knelt by Weena, pressing a hand to her belly, whispering in broken pieces of both English and Cheyenne, "You're safe. We're safe." Mabel stood, tears streaking her face. She looked at both of them, then at the body of Jonas. "I will do whatever it takes," she said. Not a promise, a plea. To make this right. Harlan nodded. He didn't need words. He felt the trust. That night by the hearth, Weena placed her head on Harlan's shoulder. The house smelled of pine and rain. She didn't speak. He stroked her hair, listening to her breath, calm even. She placed her hand over his, both resting just above her belly. He said softly, "We did it." She nodded, tears shining. She didn't question, didn't need to. The next morning they climbed the bluff again. Weena guided Harlan's arm to the little tree. It had grown slender, but alive. Small green leaves caught the light. Weena knelt down, her hand touching the earth around the base of the tree. She whispered, as if speaking to the wind and to those who had passed, for the ones who were lost. She looked up, placing her hand on her belly, her gaze turning toward the rising sun, and for the ones yet to come. She pressed her palm to his, both cradling the sapling. He knelt, his voice low, "This is ours." They didn't need rings or vows. The tree was their promise, and the child inside her would grow with it. Behind them, the prairie rose in gentle waves under the brightening sky. Their home lay quiet. Flint padded beside them. And in that moment, Harlan felt something he hadn't in years: a future. A future with Weena, their child, and a land they'd planted with truth. Spring beyond the bark, beyond the graves had come.